Fat loss is all about losing weight while holding on to as much muscle as possible. There are plenty of factors that play a role in achieving this, but not all of them are equally important. So what factors are most important for fat loss? The simple answer is to lose fat. You need a consistent calorie deficit, eating fewer calories than you burn. That is why the most crucial factor in fat loss is calorie intake, which refers to the total number of calories consumed throughout the day, and more importantly, across the week. Our energy intake plays the biggest role in influencing energy balance, which is the difference between calories in and calories out. Essentially, to lose fat, we need to maintain a consistent calorie deficit, meaning you consume fewer calories than you burn. Maintaining this calorie deficit will lead to weight loss, but simply losing weight isn't the goal. The goal is to lose body fat. However, if you only focus on losing weight, you'll lose fat, but you'll also lose a significant amount of muscle mass. Research shows that around 25% of the weight loss during dieting comes from muscle, while the remaining 75% is fat. Unless you take specific steps to preserve muscle, like following a high-protein diet, which we'll discuss later, you risk losing muscle along with fat. The next key factor for fat loss is resistance training. This has the biggest impact on how much muscle versus fat you lose during weight loss. Resistance training provides an anabolic signal to your muscles, which tells your body to retain or even build muscle during fat loss. This significantly improves the amount of lean mass you keep while losing weight, and in turn, increases the proportion of fat loss. This was demonstrated in a meta-analysis that looked at how resistance training affects body composition during weight loss. The findings showed that while calorie restriction alone is effective for losing weight, it typically leads to some muscle loss as expected. However, when resistance training is combined with calorie restriction, lean mass can be fully maintained in some cases. This leads to a higher percentage of fat loss as part of the total weight loss. So, how should you train to maximize muscle retention? Essentially, you should train just like you would if you were trying to build muscle. Here's a general guide to the best practices. Train the muscles you want to grow with at least 10 direct sets per week. Take each set close to failure with around 3 reps in reserve. Lift within the 5 to 20 rep range, adjusting weights as needed, and use exercise and techniques that ensure the target muscle group is the one being fully fatigued. The third priority for fat loss is our total daily physical activity levels. For fat loss, physical activity helps increase energy expenditure, which can support creating a calorie deficit. However, exercise might not be as effective for weight loss as we often think. For example, this study looked at the effects of a diet and exercise intervention on weight loss in 439 overweight or obese women over 1 year. One group did 45 minutes of aerobic exercise 5 times a week. Another group received personalized nutrition counseling, and the third group did both. After 1 year, all groups lost weight. The exercise group lost about 2% of their initial body weight. The diet group lost about 9%, and the combined group lost the most, around 11%. While exercise does help with weight loss, it's not as effective as diet changes alone. One reason for this is the concept of energy compensation, which means that when we increase exercise, our bodies tend to reduce energy expenditure in other areas. As a result, we don't burn as many extra calories as we might expect. This concept was explored in a research review that looked at how physical activity affects total daily energy expenditure. The researchers found evidence supporting the constrained model of energy expenditure, meaning that as we burn more energy through activity, other areas downregulate, leading to diminishing returns rather than a directly additive effect. However, it's still unclear which components of energy expenditure are downregulated, how body fat levels affect this, and whether these changes are temporary or long-term adaptations. So, while exercise does help burn more calories, it's likely not as impactful as we think, and shouldn't be the top priority for creating a calorie deficit for weight loss. That said, physical activity can also affect energy balance through appetite regulation. A research review suggested that exercise plays a role in controlling how much we eat. with low activity levels, there tends to be a mismatch between energy intake and expenditure, meaning we often feel hungrier than the energy we actually burn. But when we're moderately active, our energy intake becomes better regulated, and our appetite increases more in line with the energy we burn. Our next priority for fat loss is another key nutrition factor: daily protein intake. It's well known that eating enough protein supports muscle growth through resistance training and helps preserve muscle during weight loss. This was highlighted in a study that examined how different protein levels affected body composition during a calorie deficit. However, it's important to note that high protein alone isn't a substitute for resistance training. Resistance training has a much greater impact on preserving muscle during fat loss. Ideally, you should combine both resistance training and high protein diet for the best results. Another study tested the effects of protein intake and resistance training on body composition. 100 overweight adults followed a diet with a 600 calorie deficit for 10 weeks. One group consumed a lower protein intake of 0.8 grams per kilogram. Another consumed a higher intake of 1.3 grams. A third group combined lower protein intake with resistance training, and the last group combined with high protein with resistance training. After 10 weeks, all groups lost significant weight. The low and high protein groups maintained most of their muscle mass, but the groups doing resistance training saw an increase in muscle mass and lost more fat. The high protein plus exercise group had the best results, with the highest muscle retention and fat loss. So how much protein should you aim for? Higher protein intakes are generally better for muscle retention, but there seems to be diminishing returns beyond 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. There likely isn't much additional benefit from going higher than this. Additionally, this varies based on gender and body fat levels. Females with higher body fat may need slightly less protein, while leaner males may benefit from a bit more. The next factor in our fat loss plan is sleep. Some people think sleep should be higher on the list, and that could be true. However, there isn't enough strong evidence to say sleep has a big effect on muscle growth and fat loss, so we can't say it's more important without more solid proof. That said, we do have a couple of studies to look at. One study checked how cutting down on sleep during a calorie deficit affects body composition. In this study, 36 overweight or obese adults followed a diet that provided 95% of their daily energy needs for 8 weeks. One group kept their normal sleep habits, sleeping about 6.5 hours a night. The other group had to reduce their sleep by 90 minutes, sleeping around 5.5 hours per night on restricted days and 7.5 hours on regular days. After 8 weeks, both groups lost about the same amount of weight with similar amounts of fat and muscle loss in each group. Another study looked at 10 overweight adults over 2 14-day periods. One time they were allowed 8.5 hours of sleep per night, and the other time they were restricted to just 5.5 hours. Both times, they lost similar weight, but when they got less sleep, they lost more muscle and less fat. So, if sleep is only limited a little, it doesn't seem to hurt fat loss. But if sleep is always low, it may lead to losing more muscle and less fat. Sleep also affects fat loss in other ways, like how much we eat and how well we exercise. For example, one study found that 12 adults who slept just 4 hours per night versus 9 hours ate about 250 more calories the next day. Now let's talk about the rate of weight loss, another key factor. Being in a calorie deficit is the most important part of fat loss, but how much of a deficit also affects how much muscle versus fat is lost. A bigger deficit causes faster weight loss, while a smaller one leads to slower loss. One study on elite athletes found that those who lost weight slower, 4.2 kilograms over 9 weeks, gained a little muscle, while those who lost the same amount faster in 5 weeks lost a small amount of muscle. Both groups lost mostly fat because they were doing resistance training and eating enough protein. So, while losing weight fat isn't bad, slower weight loss, around 1% of body weight per week, usually helps keep more muscle and leads to greater fat loss. Moving on to carbs and fats, once you've set a calorie deficit and are eating enough protein, the balance of carbs and fats doesn't have much impact on fat loss. For example, one study on 62 people with fatty liver disease compared different diets: a low-carb, high-fat diet, a 5:2 ratio diet, and a more balanced diet. After 12 weeks, all groups lost weight and muscle loss was similar for everyone. If you do a lot of physical activity, eating more carbs might help with exercise performance, especially in high-volume workouts. But in general, aim for at least 0.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight per day for essential health and 1.5 grams of carbs per kilogram of exercise. I'd also highly suggest that you give this video a watch next to help you speed up the fat loss process.